My name is Angela Dienhart Hancock, and I am currently Assistant Professor of Homiletics and Worship at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And I am teaching and administrating and trying to write the next book. The last book is a contextual interpretation of the one time that Karl Barth ventured into the field of practical theology, at least in the classroom. And it just happened to take place right as Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, so it makes it a fascinating historical moment to sift through and see what he's doing in response to his context in relation to the practice of preaching.
You spend a lot of time situating Karl Barth in his theological existence, as it's called. Could you do that a little for us and tell us why that's important for him in particular?
Well, that language, theological existence, comes from Barth himself. And what it evokes for me is this idea that nothing in life is separated from the acknowledgement of the God who is God. And so there's nothing that's off limits or that should not be explored in theological terms. And that's definitely how Barth went about his life and work. It's in some contrast to actually what people in the context that I'm working in thought about this issue. Namely, they're mostly Protestants, mostly Lutherans, who thought of this in terms of these two kingdoms, that there was the secular and the sacred, and those two really didn't have much to do with each other. One was concerned with the things of God and the other wasn't. And for Barth, there was no such separation. And so, it's important to think about him as a person who moves freely and rather playfully between these different kinds of considerations and concerns.
What's the danger if you don't contextualize Barth?
Well, the danger is that you miss what he's actually saying and doing. For many decades, Barth was interpreted in this country and in some other contexts as well as sort of this inherited caricature called the neo-orthodox Barth, as someone who is not in fact concerned at all with little human beings and their messy affairs, but is so focused on God that these other things just fade from view. And because his works were then read in light of that understanding, very different things come to light if you start to recognize the way in which he's constantly engaging with the world around him.
You've got Halles and the Blumhardts on one hand, and you've got Schleiermacher and Overbeck on the other hand. These two poles in different places that Barth's navigating between. How does he do that?
Well, so I would separate out those two sets. Barth's relationship to the Blumhardts and to Overbeck, in that situation, I'm not sure you have two poles as much as you have two sides of the same coin. So with Overbeck, you have someone, a church historian, a skeptic, saying no to the very things that Christian intellectuals of his time were trying to do, which was to try to make all this palatable to enlightened, cultured people, to make Christianity something they could swallow. And Overbeck said no to that kind of apologetic effort, and that was something with which Barth resonated and appreciated about Overbeck. The Blumhardts are kind of the yes side of that same coin. The Blumhardts, father and son, on the one hand, showing what it's like to live life with this radical sense of expectation that the gospel always means kind of the end of our world and the beginning of this something new. And so with the father, you see this kind of this prayerful waiting and anticipating, and with the son, you see a kind of social activism that's non-ideological, and those are both things that Barth would take from the Blumhardts. So in a way, those they're less two poles than two aspects of the same thing, and which is why I think Barth wanted to bring them together and kind of kept them in his toolbox for the rest of his life.
But Schleiermacher and Halles are definitely sort of a Scylla and Charybdis.
Yes, okay, so with Schleiermacher and Halles, you have kind of this messy language of left and right, but I'll use it. So Halles, an extremely orthodox Lutheran authoritarian. The preacher is the one who comes and dispenses wisdom from on high, which the people must accept. Now, Schleiermacher, using the term loosely, on the left of things, and Bart, in his lectures on preparation for preaching, talked about Schleiermacher as being an advance, actually, over what Hollis was doing, precisely because for Schleiermacher, the preacher comes out of the congregation, the Gemeinde, and then returns to it. And therefore, there's less sort of authority invested in the person of the preacher, and it's more has to do with the authority of this activity, which is then temporal, and that's something that was very attractive to Bart. Now, he still thinks, he has the same basic critique of both of them, which is not surprising, right and left, so to speak, but what he sees in both of them is that they still believe that the preacher has something, a possession, that they then package and give over in what they're doing when they preach. And Bart, of course, is always wanting them to open up their hands and to dispossess. He's always trying to dispossess and decenter the preacher.
Now, I know these are vague terms, but if you take can you apply that sort of thinking to an American preaching context, just trying to read Bart into what we do today?
Yeah, so part of the problem with doing that, and it's a great temptation, and it of course happens all the time when you're working on something like this, because there are many times there are political dynamics that seem familiar. The great discipline of the historian is to try and immerse yourself in the world of the person you're focusing on, and not to try and make those parallels too easily. So I say this with that caveat right up front. What I would say is that if we think about this in terms, again, of right and left, and we say those are the extremes, what Bart means by when he rejects that has to do with this issue of whether these positions are ideologies or not, which means that they're, in his language, held with deadly seriousness. So that is the part of being extreme or being right and left that Bart absolutely rejects, because he doesn't think then that the person is free, again with the open hands, the open ears, to be able to hear what the wide horizon of the witness of Scripture has to say. You're already coming to the text armed with this ideology. The text is allowed to say certain things, but certain things are never open for consideration. And so that's one thing I think he would have to say to us, is he'd wonder, to what extent are we really willing to listen at this point, or do we have things all figured out?
So in that sort of anti-ideological vein, how do you see Bart escaping that constant criticism that his theology is too austere, that he's too detached?
Yeah, I mean, in my own work, I don't find him detached ever. What I find him doing is, yes, constantly going back. I mean, it's not surprising in a Reformed theologian, right, that this is the impulse, that you're always going back and listening again and testing again. And this is a person who could write an essay and say how I changed my mind. I mean, that wasn't necessarily something that you could say about many of his contemporaries during this time or later, that they're willing to recognize this constant need to begin again from the beginning, to let go and listen again. So.
How about in the ways that he dealt with the Deutsche Christen? Am I saying that right?
Deutsche Christen, yeah. So this is the Deutsche Christen are the party within the German Protestant Church who thoroughly embrace the National Socialist agenda. So actually seeing in National Socialism a revelation from God, and everything that came along with that, which included obviously anti-Semitism, anti-internationalism, for lack of a better word, anti-Marxism, anti-pacifism, and also a rejection of thought. To put it most simply, I mean, it was an anti-intellectual movement as well. So it was all about action, which would have been true of National Socialist ideology in general. So Barth definitely pushes back against that. His strategy to do so is always to try to get underneath it and ask what are the commitments that are funding this. The two theologians who are the brain trust of this movement would probably be Paul Althaus and Emanuel Hirsch. And where Barth goes after them has to do with this issue of the orders of creation, the idea that race and Blut and Volk are things that are ordained by God, and therefore that Christian people, in order to be obedient to God, have to do whatever means necessary to protect the integrity of something like race and Volk. And so, yes, that's where Barth goes after them.
Well, I love your strategy in writing the book. I love the format where it alternates between like historical context and storytelling, and then Barth's way of interpreting and responding to his context. And it really lent a sort of a sense of urgency to the text. You even gave it a plot, which is very rare in academic books. And I was just wondering, how did you go about making connections between Barth's work and the context? I mean, you use a lot of his letters, but how did you situate him? So I relied on the best historians of the period I could find. I mean, this is doing a kind of Alltagsgeschichte, a kind of small history of this one person in this 1 year of his life, but trying to situate it in relation to these big, broad dynamics. So I relied on the best historians and social historians that could help me with that period, including people who worked on Bonn, the city of Bonn in Germany, and specifically what was going on right there on the ground, what was going on at the university and in German universities at the time. Any kind of source documents I could get my hands on, I used. Published and some unpublished letters were key. I mean, the tricky part about it is that unless you work with these source documents in their original language, what you miss is the many times that there are direct resonances to the rhetoric of the time. That sometimes gets completely lost and obscured in translation. So the challenge is to recognize that you have to start from the beginning. And letters were, in many ways, the most fascinating piece of the source documents that I had. Not just letters from Barth, but some of the letters to Barth. In some ways, you learn more about how he thought about some issues in his situation by reading letters that he wrote to people who are really far outside the situation, because there's lots of things that I don't need to say in letters to people that I'm very close to who share the same world. I don't need to. There's a lot of things that just remain unsaid. So it's times when he writes to, McConaughey, a Scotsman, where you see him trying to explain some things about the situation to someone who would have no sense of it, that you start to understand how it is that he's seeing the situation that he's in. This is such an interesting book, just because of the period and because of all the issues that it raises. But I'm wondering if you had an audience in mind that you specifically would like to see read this book and that you were writing to.
So I wrote, on the one hand, to Barth nerds, people who either are real champions of Barth or who are real skeptics about his relevance for today. Maybe even more to the cheerleaders who I think are sometimes exuberant about Barth in some mistaken ways. And so I want to be a part of this ongoing effort to help people see Barth in relation to his context. So that's one kind of audience. And then I also am writing for pastors who are tempted. There are many ways we can abdicate the practice of sermon preparation. There are lots of commentaries who can do the interpreting for us. There are lots of other sermon resources and online resources that can make us be tempted not to take that deep step that Barth is talking about in these lectures. I mean, they're not actually doesn't ever use the word homiletics to describe what he's doing. What he's doing is Übungen in Predigtvorbereitung, exercises in sermon preparation, in the preparation of sermons. And it's that practice that he sees as so central and key. And that is, I think, a practice that's endangered for us because we have a lot of ways just not to do it, not to spend that time with the open hands listening. So I also interested in talking to pastors.
I'm glad you said that word. I had no idea how to pronounce that as I was reading it.
Yes, it's not fun to spell either.
Yeah. Well, wonderful. What would you say you hope the impact would be for your book, just as a wrap-up question?
I hope it would continue this work of unseating the neo-Orthodox Bart and be one of many efforts to take rather modest, small moments of times when Bart has taught or written something and really reading them carefully in relation to the context, just to see what's actually going on there. So that's my hope.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks.